Here's the thing. My job is to point you in the direction of some interesting literature, some discoveries, some arguments, and get you to discover things. It's a nice job because it's easy to do that compared to the discovery bit, which is the more intellectually difficult, painful thing, your job. But sometimes, so that's of course why I'm particularly keen to find puzzles that need to be solved. I think that's important. And I hope that you're going to help me to solve some of those puzzles. But sometimes just to understand a puzzle, it's worth looking at potential solutions or aspects of a solution, even if sometimes that's only to better understand the puzzle or to provoke people to provide alternative ideas. So here's the puzzle that currently occupies us. We found that there's at best weak, I think I'm being generous there, evidence for cultural variation in moral psychology. There probably is cultural variation in moral psychology, but the evidence that we have for it's not really very compelling. And in particular, the evidence about the liberals versus conservatives is really hard to accept. We've also seen that some theoretical problems with the arguments for moral reframing, right? It's very hard for us to generate the prediction that moral reframing should work. And yet, moral reframing seems to work, right? That's where the evidence is strongest. Brilliant, because it leaves us with a puzzle. Why is it that moral reframing works? The prediction doesn't follow from the theory. Theory doesn't seem to be supported by evidence. And yet, it all works. What's going on there? Now you might say, look, Steve, it's just an accident, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So what I'm saying is, look, not really going to buy that, but this looks good. So I got the conclusion of the argument, I've lost some premises. How does that work? Well, Feinberg and Willer say this. They asked how moral reframing works, and they say the primary explanation is that morally reframed messages are influential because targets perceive a match between their moral convictions and the argument. And that's exactly, of course, the view that the Joanne, Lars, Joseph objection, as I call it, targets. That objection says, well, look, if we take the evidence at face value, people who are socially conservative tend to put equal weight on harm and fairness as purity, loyalty to one's in-group, respect for authority, and so on. So there's no reason to think that they would see more or less of a match when the argument's framed in these different ways, right? It should be more or less equally matching. It's very puzzling. So what's going on here? What's going on here? Well, a natural thought here is that we might try to get away from what Feinberg and Willer call the primary explanation and find an alternative to it. That's to say, we might try to explain the observed effects on attitudes and actions without appeal to cultural variation and moral concerns. And so what we might try to do is to get away from invoking moral foundations theory whatsoever, right? Not because it's not brilliant. I love, I'm drawn to moral foundations theory as a thing of beauty, but it's something for which we have a lot of evidence. I find it difficult. So I'd rather be able to draw a conclusion without relying on that complicated theory. But can I? I'll take you through a series of steps. So Hurst and Stern recently manipulated two things separately. So they manipulated the content of the message and the stated source of the message. So what they had then was four kinds of message. They had a message which stated that it came from liberals and was framed in terms of harm and unfairness. They had the same message but stated that it came from conservatives. Then they had a conservative style message, so framed in terms of, in their experiment, all five moral foundations, so both issues about harm and issues about purity, and that could either come from a conservative, allegedly, or from a liberal. And what they found was very interesting. What they found is that the combination of conservative moral frame and conservative source did move conservatives' pro-environmental attitudes, but, here's the interesting thing, across both studies, they found only one case where the conservative frame alone influenced support for pro-environmental attitudes. In this case, they were thinking about transitioning from fossil fuels, even when combined with a liberal source. So essentially what they're saying here is, look, it's not really clear that if you put a conservative message and a liberal source together, you're going to have any effect. It doesn't seem like they found much evidence of that. Not to say that they found evidence against it, they didn't. They just didn't find that it worked. And you might say, well, look, doesn't that contradict what Feinberg and Willer found? Well, not really, because of course they might not find evidence and they might find evidence. But, look, let's roll with it for a second. Because Hurst and Stern themselves address this point. They say, look, our conservatively framed messages were written with language intended to trigger all 5 moral foundations, whereas Feinberg and Willer and others who've done this tended to try to trigger just, binding foundations or just individualizing foundations. You saw that very clearly with Kidwell and colleagues, right? You see, I saw some people reacting when I put the socially conservative one. I saw some people reacting, join the fight, our great leader. You find that difficult? Yeah, you do, don't you? I got that. So they say, look, why is that relevant? Well, it's possible that when you include all 5 foundations, reference to harm and fairness, the message was too reminiscent of familiar liberal messaging. The subtle out-group association may have weakened the overall appeals. So when I read this, what I thought was, look, it seems like it could be that what Feinberg and Willer have done is they've confounded message frame with message source in their study, right? Accidentally. Because it may be that what's happening, this is actually probably not quite the right word, it's probably not strictly speaking a confound here, but it may well be that when you change the frame in some way, you're changing both how people perceive the message, content, but also who they think is the likely source of the message. So in Feinberg and Willer's study, where they didn't really have control over what their subjects perceived to be the source of the message, it could be that the reframing made a difference via the source. Now that's made more plausible by another recent study. This is Fielding and colleagues from 2020, and what they did was to measure environmental attitudes at 2 times. I've forgotten, this is environmental attitudes towards a particular policy and it escapes me. Anyway, have a look, it's an interesting paper. So here's the Democrats at time 1, and this group of Democrats were given a message which allegedly was from a Democrat, and after they've read that message, this is time 2, you can see that there's a significant increase in their support for these environmental policies. Whereas when you do it with the Republicans, you're not allowed to boo. You're not allowed to boo. When you do it with the Republicans, you can see that, first of all, they start off, classic pattern, with relatively little support for the climate policy anyway, and that the message has no difference, makes no difference to their attitudes. It's as if they'd never got the message at all. All right, so what happens though, if you give them the same message, same content, but tell them that it's from a Republican? So with the Democrats, in this case, there was no observed difference between pre-message and post-message. The message didn't seem to affect the Democrats one way or the other, even though the content hadn't changed. Interesting. But here's the really brilliant thing. I love this so much. The Republican participants, same message as they got previously, told it's from a Republican, bam! Look at that. Really big difference, right? That's a difference that's so significant that if it wasn't significant, just looking at the graph, you wouldn't believe that it wasn't significant. It's an enormous difference. Very good. So what's going on here? Fielding and colleagues suggest that it's possible that the values framing in past studies worked because it provided conservatives with information about the source of the message. When messages aligned with conservative values, Republicans, people who are socially right in the US context, filled in the gaps and simply presumed that the message came from a socially conservative source. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. So in a US context, I think this is right, Democrat counts as more socially conservative on the whole. A Republican counts as more socially liberal on the whole. Although, of course, there are interesting exceptions to that. It's a crude measure, but good enough. All right, so let's see where we are. I think what Fielding and colleagues have established is that the perceived source of a message can make a surprisingly big difference to its effect on someone's environmental attitudes. That I think we have very good evidence for here. There's a further thing which now we have to remark is a speculation. The speculation is that moral reframing works in part, or perhaps entirely, but certainly in part, because it provides clues to the likely source of the message. Now that counts as a speculation because that's not something established here by the data. That's not something here established by the data. Our objection to the Feinberg and Willer explanation for what's going on with moral reframing is not that we know that it's wrong, it's that we haven't got good evidence for it. So here we're introducing an alternative speculation. One last study. I can't resist this one. This is very interesting. So this is Pope Francis' study, and what Schuld and colleagues did was very simple. They took a very large sample. It's supposed to be a nationally representative sample of US citizens, and they divided them up, and some of them got a Pope prompt. This is Pope Francis, and some of them didn't get a Pope prompt. And at the time of their study, the Pope had published an encyclical touching on climate change, and had also visited the US. So some people, I think half of them actually, were given a prompt which was roughly this. This isn't exactly what they said. How much do you know about Pope Francis' view on climate change? And the idea is that that would sort of prompt them to think about the Pope and climate change. And then they were asked, this is the exact wording, do you consider climate change to be a moral or ethical issue? Whereas a minority, this is kind of shocking, a minority of respondents reported perceiving climate change as a moral issue in the control condition. This figure rose among those in the Pope Prime condition. That difference is significant. That's what we care about. So in some ways, this is quite shocking. We're literally talking about saving the planet here, but a minority of respondents report perceiving this as a moral issue in a US context, right? So that's kind of interesting. But what's should be the primary focus for us, once you can sort of get over that, I guess many of you are already aware of this, what should be the primary focus for us is that the mere Pope Prime, it creates significant increase in how likely it is that people are to think of climate as a moral issue. Why is that? Well, presumably this again is because the messenger, the source of a message, getting people to think about the source of message or associate it with particular people, can have a big effect, a surprisingly big effect, on whether they accept and are influenced by that message. And what we find, interestingly, is that the Pope Prime effect exerted a stronger effect on Republicans. So in the US context, these are socially conservative, versus Democrats, more socially liberal. On the whole, they're equally likely to report perceiving climate change as a moral or ethical issue, regardless of the condition there. So this once again suggests that maybe there's something about the source of the message that really is driving the effects. All right, now here's the thing. It can't all be explained by the source of the message, I think. It can't all be explained by the source of the message, I think. I think that very unlikely. What we really want to do, if we're to solve the puzzle, is to look for different candidate explanations. So here's a second candidate explanation, one which is a bit harder to understand, perhaps, harder for me anyway, and also one where we're moving further away from direct evidence. And this actually comes from Kidwell 2013, their study. It's an enormously rich paper, and I don't think that their study directly sort of bears out the fluency idea, but they do have the idea that the type of appeal, the person's political ideology and the moral foundations, I'm not really sure why the arrows are working this way, but essentially these two factors, right? So whether you're appealing to individualizing or binding foundations, whether you're appealing to someone who has a socially conservative or a socially liberal political ideology, those will both influence how fluently they can process the message, how easily they can read it in effect. And they think effectively that the more fluently someone can process the message, the more likely they are to accept it. And there's a very good reason for that. So fluency is something that some people will be fully aware of, but a lot of people won't realise this. Fluency is something which is tremendously important to all kinds of judgments that you and I make. So for example, if I show you this face, it should be a face which appears similar to you. Now, even if you know that this is not a similar face, I hope some people are there going, oh gosh, I'm sure I've seen that face before, who is it? But even if you know that this isn't a familiar face, you should have the appearance of a familiar face. It should give rise in you to a feeling of familiarity, right? Why is that? Well, this face is used in, or some version of faces of this type are used in order to establish a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that the more fluently you can process a face, and the greater difficulty you have in actually identifying the face, the more familiar the thing should feel to you, right? So fluency goes with familiarity. And what's happening here is that you're creating a face which is ultra easy to process by morphing two very familiar faces. So in this case, this is Obama and Clinton. It's Obama and Clinton. I can't do any updates to this now because the recent sort of political history is just too tragic, unfortunately. So I'm hoping for times again when we can morph the faces of famous politicians, and it will be fun. Anyway, this is Clinton and Obama from back in the day, and it's ultra familiar because when you morph faces in this way, you combine features of two very familiar faces, you get something that's super easy to process because you've got a lot of experience processing it. But you also get, as predicted, super strong feelings of familiarity for these morphed faces that people can't recognize. And the theory is, the evidence seems to support it, the theory is that fluency of face processing increases how strongly you think you've seen the face before. So in general, if we look across the research, we'd see that the fluency of processing matters for a whole variety of judgments. So how familiar something is, whether or not you're the agent of an action, and also whether or not something is surprising. So often surprise judgments are not driven by how novel the information is as such, but rather how familiar, how easily you can process the information, or not how fluently you can process the information. So there's a decent body of research which indicates that when you process a message fluently, you're more likely to accept that it's true and more likely to be influenced by it. And I'm told, I don't know if this is true, but I'm told that that's why lawyers, good lawyers, will get their defendants or witnesses and kind of prep them so that they really remember their lines and go over and over and over it so that they can talk very fluently. And their own fluency of speaking is supposed to lend some credibility to what they're saying. I'm also told that simply repeating a message is supposed to make it more believable because it becomes easier to process. I don't know if those things are true, but I do know that fluency influences how likely you are to believe something that's true. So I think this model then is quite plausible. What could be happening as you're engaged in moral reframing is that you're presenting an argument to people of different political ideologies, which is either harder or easier for them to process. You're modulating processing fluency, and that could be having an effect on how likely that message is to influence them. So where am I? My question was, could we explain the observed effects on attitudes and actions without appeal to cultural variation in moral concerns? And so avoiding moral foundations theory. Can we cut moral foundations theory out? Well, what we've seen is that moral reframing could be effective for a variety of reasons. So it could be that moral foundations theory is true, there is the cultural variation, and somehow, although we have the Lars Joseph objection, it could be that somehow the moral reframing is actually making it appeal more as a moral issue to people who are socially conservative, right? That's always a possibility. Alternatively, but this is now a speculation that's no better grounded than that other one, it could be that what happens with moral reframing is it just indicates a source. When I start telling you about, we have to do this because we have to be loyal to members of our own society, and we have to show respect for authority, you're like, oh God, Steve, that's a bit right. That's a bit right? You straight away realise who I am, and then you either throw it out or you lean towards me, depending on your political identity. And it may be that what's happening is that there's an effect of fluency here, so that framing a message in terms of certain moral foundations can make it highly disfluent to some people and highly fluent to others, and that may influence how they believe it. Or, and this is the really key thing, there could be other factors at work as well. So you notice that these explanations are not exclusive, and indeed Feinberg and Willer themselves think that these are both factors, although in their view, this is, I think, unsupported at the moment, the primary driver is the match between the person's own moral psychology and the moral framing of the issue. In their view, that's the primary driver, but these are both factors. So this is by no means evidence for this by no means contradicts their view. Everything is on the table, everything is to play for. We have our puzzle. What we need to know is what are the possible solutions and what would count as evidence favouring one solution or one family of solutions over another.